The doors of the council chamber sealed shut behind me, before I even reached them, and the sound alone told me everything I needed to know. It was not a mechanical click, it was a verdict. My name is Daniel Hart, and I was standing in the center of the Concorde's grand chamber, surrounded by 9 towering species who had been flying between stars since before my ancestors learned to write. Above me, their delegates glowed in soft alien light, their voices layered in translated tones that tried to sound gentle, even as they delivered the harshest judgment humanity had ever received. The human species is hereby suspended from the Galactic Concorde, the presiding delegate said, a tall being with silver skin and eyes like still water. Effective immediately, all access to hyperlane travel, shared technology, and interstellar trade is revoked. Humanity will remain confined to its home system. Any attempt to breach this boundary will be treated as an act of aggression. I did not shout. I did not argue. Arguing was what they expected from us, another data point to confirm their fears. Instead, I asked one simple question. Why? The delegate did not blink. Your species is too unpredictable, too aggressive, too fast to anger, and too slow to forgive. You have not yet earned the right to stand among civilized worlds. Around the chamber, I could hear quiet sounds that I recognized instantly, even through the translation static. Laughter. Not loud, not mocking in an obvious way, but there, tucked beneath their breath, the kind of laughter reserved for something small and foolish. I looked at Laura Bennett, standing beside me, the only other human delegate allowed inside the chamber that day. Her jaw was tight, her hands folded in front of her, steady, despite everything crashing down around us. She had spent 6 years building diplomatic relationships with 3 different species blocks. 6 years, gone in under a minute. You cannot do this, she said quietly, not pleading, simply stating a fact she needed on the record. We have met every requirement you set for us, every single one. Requirements can change, the delegate replied. The council has spoken. Escort them out. 2 guards, tall creatures wrapped in dark armor that hummed faintly with energy shielding, stepped toward us. I did not move away in fear. I walked toward the exit myself, matching their pace, because I refused to let the last image these species had of humanity be one of us being dragged out like criminals. As the massive doors began to close, I turned back one final time. The chamber, filled with beings who had ended wars, built empires, and mapped 1,000 star systems, looked down at 2 humans leaving in silence. And still, somewhere in that crowd, someone laughed again. I remember thinking, in that exact moment, that laughter is a dangerous thing to leave behind you when you exile someone. Because laughter fades, but memory does not. The walk back to our shuttle felt longer than it should have. Laura did not speak until we were sealed inside, alone, the hum of the engine the only sound between us. They just ended us, she said. 12 years of work, gone. They didn't end us, I said. They just told us to stop asking for permission. She looked at me like I had lost my mind, and maybe I had, a little. But somewhere beneath the shock, beneath the anger, burning quietly in my chest, a different feeling was taking root. Clarity. The shuttle lifted off from the Concorde's orbital platform, and through the viewport I watched the massive structure shrink behind us, its lights glittering like a city that had just told an entire planet it was no longer welcome. We reached Earth 11 days later. The news had already spread before we landed, carried across every channel, every screen, every home. I remember stepping off the shuttle at the landing terminal in Geneva, and seeing the crowd waiting, not with anger, not with panic, but with something quieter. People wanted to know what came next. I stood in front of a podium that evening, cameras from every nation aimed at my face, and I said the only thing I truly believed. Today, the Galactic Concorde closed a door. That door is not the only one in existence. We will build our own. It sounded brave on television. It felt terrifying up close, because the truth was, humanity had no hyperlane technology of its own. Every advancement we had used for the past 40 years, every improved engine, every shielded hull, every long-range communication array, had come from limited technology sharing agreements with the Concorde, agreements that no longer existed. Within a week, every ship humanity owned that used Concorde components was grounded pending inspection. Our 3 research stations near Mars went quiet, their scientists recalled home, The small fleet we had built for exploration, barely a dozen ships strong, sat useless in orbit, their engines built on borrowed science we were no longer allowed to touch. I remember standing in a command room in Geneva with Marcus Ford, our lead propulsion engineer, staring at diagrams of engines we could no longer legally operate. "They didn't just cut us off," Marcus said, running a hand through his hair. "They took the ladder and left us at the bottom of the well." "Then we dig a new well," I said. He looked at me, unimpressed, tired. "With what, Daniel? We don't have their materials. We don't have their formulas. Everything we built was borrowed." "Then we stop borrowing," I said. "We start building from what we actually understand, from the ground up. Our own equations, our own metals, our own mistakes." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost like relief. "You know," he said, "nobody's ever let us fail on our own terms before. Maybe it's time we did." That single sentence became the quiet motto of everything that followed. Over the next several months, something strange happened across the planet. Instead of despair, there was momentum. Universities that had spent years studying Concorde technology pivoted overnight, tearing apart old models and rebuilding them from first principles. Governments that had spent decades arguing over resources suddenly found common ground in a single shared goal: survival on our own terms. I traveled constantly during that period, moving between research facilities in Tokyo, Nairobi, Toronto, and Santiago, watching scientists and engineers who had once specialized in narrow fields suddenly cross into each other's work, sharing notes, arguing over chalkboards, building something none of them fully understood yet, but all of them believed in. Ellen Price, a physicist working out of a lab in Nairobi, showed me something that changed the direction of everything. She had taken salvaged debris from a Concorde scout vessel, one that had drifted too close to our system months earlier, and suffered what the official report called a mechanical failure, and had begun mapping its underlying energy patterns. "It's not magic," she told me, standing in front of a wall covered in equations. "It's just physics we hadn't been allowed to see fully. They gave us pieces before, small components, filtered technology. This is the first time we've had something whole enough to actually study properly." "Can you build from it?" I asked. "Not copy it," she said. "Copying it would take resources and materials we don't have, but understand it, enough to build our own version. Cruder, maybe less efficient at first, but ours. Yes, I think we can." I remember standing in that lab, looking at equations scrawled across 3 whiteboards, and feeling something I had not felt since the day we were exiled. Hope, not the soft kind, but the sharp, determined kind that comes from people who have decided failure is simply not an option they are willing to accept. 6 months after our expulsion, the first prototype engine, built entirely from human-derived understanding, powered up in a testing facility outside Reykjavik. It was small, inefficient compared to Concorde standards, and it ran for only 11 seconds before shutting down. But for those 11 seconds, it worked, and everyone in that room understood exactly what it meant. We were no longer waiting for permission. We were building our own way forward, one imperfect breakthrough at a time, and nothing the Concorde had said in that chamber was going to stop what had already begun. 11 seconds of engine burn does not sound like much, but it changed the pace of everything that followed. Within a year of that first successful test, humanity had moved from theory to construction, and I found myself standing on a launch platform outside Nairobi, watching the first fully human-built long-range vessel prepare for its maiden flight. We called it the Horizon. It was not elegant. Its hull was thicker than it needed to be, because we did not yet trust our own alloys the way the Concorde trusted theirs. Its systems were redundant, to the point of excess, because every engineer who worked on it had grown up hearing stories about how fragile spaceflight could be. But it was ours, built without a single borrowed blueprint, and when its engines ignited and it lifted off the ground, the entire crowd gathered at the platform went silent, watching as centuries of dependency lifted away with it. I was given command of that first flight, not because I was the most qualified pilot, but because the Council of Nations wanted someone who had stood in that Concorde chamber and heard the verdict firsthand, to be the one who proved them wrong. Beside me in the cockpit sat Nora Blake, our lead navigator. a woman who had spent years mapping theoretical routes through our home system, using nothing but salvaged sensor data and careful mathematics. "Ready when you are," she said, her hands steady over the controls, despite the weight of what we were about to attempt. We were not attempting anything reckless. Our mission was simple: survey the outer edge of our own solar system, an area the Concorde had once patrolled lightly but never fully claimed. Still, every person on that ship understood what it meant to fly somewhere without asking anyone's approval first. The flight itself took 11 days. We passed the orbit of Mars, then the scattered debris fields near the asteroid belt, then out toward the cold, quiet edges near Neptune, places human ships had rarely traveled without Concorde escort. I remember standing at the viewport during the final stretch, watching the sun shrink behind us until it was barely more than a bright star among countless others. "It's strange," Nora said, joining me at the viewport. "We grew up being told this kind of distance belonged to someone else, that we needed permission to see it properly." "Not anymore," I said. What we found near the outer edge of our system surprised all of us. Sensor readings picked up structures, small automated relay stations, clearly built by the Concorde decades earlier, long abandoned, their systems dark and silent. They had been watching our system this entire time, quietly, without ever telling us. Marcus, who had joined the mission as our engineering lead, spent 2 days studying one of the relay stations after we docked alongside it carefully. What he found confirmed something I had already begun to suspect. "These aren't defense stations," he said, presenting his findings to the small crew gathered in the ship's central bay. "They're observation posts. The Concorde has been monitoring our development for years, long before we ever met them formally. They knew exactly how fast we were advancing. That's part of why they were so afraid." Grace Dawson, our mission's lead scientist, crossed her arms as she studied the data on the screen. "They didn't exile us because we're dangerous," she said. "They exiled us because we're fast. Faster than anything they've dealt with before. And fast, uncontrolled growth terrifies powers who built their entire structure on slow, careful expansion." I stood there letting that sink in. It reframed everything. We were not punished for being violent or unstable, not truly. We were punished for growing at a pace that made established powers nervous about losing their advantage. That realization changed our approach entirely. If the Concorde feared our speed, then slowing down to prove ourselves worthy of their approval was never going to work. The only path forward was to keep moving, faster and smarter, until speed itself became our greatest strength, instead of something to apologize for. We returned to Earth with data that reshaped our entire strategic direction. The Council of Nations, which had been cautiously funding expansion efforts, suddenly found itself flooded with new urgency. If the Concorde had been watching us quietly for years, then our expulsion had not been a sudden decision. It had been building for a long time, and it meant they considered us a long-term concern, not a short-term inconvenience. Over the following 2 years, our expansion accelerated in ways even I had not fully anticipated. Shipyards that had once built cautious research vessels began producing colony ships instead, designed to carry not just scientific equipment, but entire communities, prepared to establish permanent settlements beyond our home system's traditional boundaries. I was placed in command of the first of these colony fleets, a project named the Ceres Compact, made up of 6 ships carrying just over 4,000 colonists, along with enough supplies, equipment, and raw material processors to establish a fully independent settlement from nothing. Before departure, I stood in the main hangar with Henry Voss, the newly appointed head of our expanding fleet command, a calm, methodical man who had spent decades in naval leadership before transitioning into overseeing our growing space program. "You understand what you're doing here goes beyond exploration," Henry said, watching workers load the final supply crates onto the lead ship. "This is the first true test of whether humanity can build something permanent outside our home system, without anyone's approval or protection." "I understand exactly what it means," I said. "There won't be any rescue fleet if something goes wrong," he continued. "No Concorde patrol coming to help if you run into trouble out there. You'll be entirely on your own." "We've been on our own since the day they closed those chamber doors," I said. "This is just the first time we're choosing where that solitude takes us." Henry allowed himself a small, tired smile. "Good answer." The Ceres Compact departed 3 weeks later. carrying colonists selected not just for their skills, but for their willingness to build something from nothing, in a place with no guarantees and no safety net beyond what we brought with us. Among them was Victor Lane, a former military strategist turned settlement planner, someone whose calm, careful thinking would prove essential in the months that followed. Our destination was a system nearly 4 months' travel from Earth, using our current engine capabilities. A system the old Concorde relay stations had marked as resource-rich but unclaimed, likely overlooked simply because it held no strategic value to established powers already comfortable with their own territory. The journey tested every system we had built. Twice, our lead ship experienced power fluctuations that forced emergency repairs mid-flight, reminding all of us just how new and unproven our technology truly was. Marcus and his engineering team worked around the clock during those moments, patching systems together with a mixture of careful precision and stubborn determination. We built this fast, Marcus admitted to me during one particularly tense repair session, sweat on his brow as he worked beneath an exposed panel. Faster than the Concorde ever would have allowed us to. Mistakes are going to happen. Then we fix them and keep moving, I said. That's the only option we have left. When we finally arrived at the target system, the sight that greeted us silenced every conversation on the bridge. A pale blue world orbited a stable yellow star, surrounded by 2 smaller moons, and a wide asteroid field, rich with minerals our sensors identified almost immediately as valuable. It was not perfect. The atmosphere required adjustment before long-term habitation could begin safely, but it was real, untouched, and entirely open for us to claim. Grace, standing beside me as the scanning data filled the screen, spoke quietly. We're really doing this. We're actually building something out here. We already did the hard part, I said. We survived long enough to try. Over the following months, the Ceres Compact transformed from a fleet of ships into the foundation of a settlement. Victor coordinated the construction of initial habitat domes, designed to shelter colonists while atmospheric processors slowly adjusted the planet's environment toward something more suitable for long-term human life. Engineers built the first permanent power grid using knowledge developed entirely from our own post-exile research, without a single borrowed component from Concorde technology. I remember standing outside the central dome during its completion ceremony, watching colonists gather for the first sunrise, viewed from what would soon be called New Providence, the first true human colony beyond our original solar system. Children who had been born during the journey took their first steps on solid ground beneath an alien sky, and for a moment, the weight of everything we had lost in that Concorde chamber felt lighter than it had in years. Henry Voss sent a message from Earth shortly after receiving our confirmation of successful settlement, his voice carrying quiet pride through the transmission. The Council wants to know what you'd like to name this achievement officially, he said. History will remember what you call it. I thought about the laughter I had heard echoing through that chamber, the quiet dismissal in every word the Concorde delegate had spoken about our species being unworthy, unpredictable, incapable of building anything lasting on our own terms. Tell them it's the beginning, I said. Tell them humanity didn't need their permission to build a future. We just needed the chance to try. What none of us fully understood yet, standing beneath that alien sunrise, was just how quickly that single settlement would grow into something far larger than any of us had imagined, and how soon the rest of the galaxy would be forced to notice. 5 years after the founding of New Providence, I stood on an observation deck overlooking a skyline that had not existed when we first landed there, watching transport vessels rise and descend between newly constructed towers, and I found it difficult to remember the quiet, empty world we had first arrived at. What had begun as a single settlement had grown into the anchor point of an entire network. 3 additional colonies had been established within the same star cluster, each connected by trade routes we had built and maintained entirely ourselves. Shipyards that once produced simple colony transports now constructed vessels capable of carrying cargo, defense systems, and eventually, warships designed for a purpose none of us wanted to admit we might eventually need. Grace Dawson, who had become the lead administrator overseeing scientific development across the growing colonies, met me on the observation deck that morning carrying a data pad filled with updated survey reports. We've mapped 17 additional systems within range of our current fuel capabilities, she said. 4 of them show strong potential for settlement. 2 are already inhabited by smaller, independent species, who have never been part of the Concord. Independent species, I repeated. Meaning what exactly? Meaning species who were either overlooked by the Concord expansion, or deliberately excluded from it, she said. Too small, too different, or too resource poor to be considered valuable trade partners. Some of them have been quietly surviving on the edges of Concord territory for generations, ignored entirely. I thought about that for a long moment. The Concord had built its entire structure around selective inclusion, deciding which species deserved a seat at their table, and which did not. We had been judged too fast, too unpredictable. These other species had simply been judged not useful enough to matter. I want to meet them, I said. Not as conquerors, as equals. Grace studied me carefully. That's a bold approach for a species that's still finding its own footing. Maybe that's exactly why it works, I said. We know what it feels like to be dismissed. We're not going to repeat that mistake with anyone else. 3 weeks later, I traveled aboard a diplomatic vessel named the Meridian's Oath toward a system Grace's team had identified as home to a species called the Vray. Small, resourceful beings who had developed impressive engineering skills despite limited resources, living quietly on the fringes of explored space for generations without ever being formally acknowledged by any major power. Laura Bennett, who had transitioned from her role as a Concord delegate into becoming our lead diplomatic officer, accompanied me on the journey, along with a small support team trained specifically in careful, respectful first contact protocols we had developed, based entirely on our own painful experience of being judged too quickly by outsiders. When we arrived in orbit above their homeworld, we were met not with hostility, but with cautious curiosity. Their communications, translated through systems Ellen Price had helped refine over the previous years, carried a tone of guarded surprise. "You are human," came the first message, translated through careful algorithms. "The exiled species." "We are," Laura replied honestly, refusing to hide from the label the Concord had given us. "We are also a species looking for partners, not subjects. We do not represent the Concord. We never will again." There was a long pause before the response came through. "Then perhaps we have something to discuss." What followed over the next several days became one of the most important negotiations in humanity's short history beyond Earth. The Vray, it turned out, had developed remarkable material science techniques out of necessity, working with limited resources for generations, techniques that could significantly improve the efficiency of our expanding shipyards. In exchange, we offered something they had never truly possessed: access to a growing trade network, defensive cooperation, and most importantly, genuine respect as equals, rather than as a resource to be exploited. I remember sitting across from Thessa, the Vray's primary representative, a small being with intricate patterns across her skin that shifted color based on emotional state, patterns I slowly learned to read as clearly as facial expressions. "The Concord offered us nothing for 3 generations, Thessa said through the translator, her patterns shifting toward a deep, thoughtful blue. Not hostility, worse, indifference, as though we did not exist at all. "We understand that feeling," I said. "Maybe better than any species you've encountered before." "That is precisely why we are willing to trust you," she replied. "A species that has felt what we have felt understands the value of what you are offering." The agreement we reached with the Vray became the template for what followed over the next several years. Rather than expanding through conquest or exploitation, we expanded through partnership, seeking out species the Concord had ignored, dismissed, or deliberately excluded, offering them genuine cooperation instead of the careful, conditional acceptance the Concord had always demanded. Within 4 years, our small network of colonies had grown into something far larger, a loose but genuine coalition of species, each contributing their own strengths, each treated as an equal partner, rather than a subordinate client. We called it the Sovereign Compact, a name chosen deliberately to emphasize that no member surrendered their independence to belong. Marcus Ford, who had grown from an engineer into the lead architect of our expanding infrastructure, once described the difference perfectly during a planning session attended by representatives from 4 different species. "The Concord built an empire out of control," he said. "Careful, structured, slow, designed to keep every member dependent on the center. We're building something different. We're building a network where every member is strong enough to stand alone, but chooses to stand together anyway. That difference mattered more than any of us initially realized. Species who joined the Sovereign Compact were not required to adopt human technology, human governance, or human customs. They contributed what they could, benefited from shared resources and protection, and retained full control over their own worlds and decisions. It was slower to formalize than the rigid structure the Concord had built, but it created loyalty the Concord had never managed to earn from its own client species. Victor Lane, overseeing the defensive development of our growing territory, raised a concern during one particular strategy meeting that stayed with me long after the discussion ended. "We've built something valuable," he said, studying a star map covered in newly claimed territories and partner systems. "Valuable things attract attention. We should assume the Concord is watching everything we've built, and we should assume they are not the only ones." "What makes you say that?" I asked. "Because resource-rich, loosely defended border regions rarely stay unnoticed for long," he said, "especially by client species eager to prove their usefulness to the Concord by handling problems the Concord doesn't want to handle directly." I remember the weight of that statement settling over the room. We had spent 5 years building something remarkable, expanding carefully, forming partnerships based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. But growth of any kind eventually draws attention, and not all attention comes wrapped in good intentions. Henry Voss, who had remained in overall command of our expanding fleet operations from a coordination station near New Providence, reinforced Victor's concerns during a private conversation shortly afterward. "Our defensive capabilities have grown significantly," he said, "but they've grown to protect against accidents, resource disputes between our own colonies, minor territorial disagreements. We have never truly tested our capabilities against an organized hostile force." "You think that test is coming?" I said. "I think it would be foolish to assume it isn't," he replied. "The Concord exiled us because they feared our growth. That fear doesn't simply disappear because we've stayed quiet for 5 years. If anything, our continued success likely makes that fear worse." I took his warning seriously. Over the following months, without slowing our diplomatic expansion, we quietly increased investment in defensive infrastructure across our core systems. Shipyards that had focused primarily on colony transports and trade vessels began allocating a portion of their capacity toward defensive cruisers, still limited in number, still far from a true military force, but no longer non-existent. Ellen Price, whose research into salvaged Concord technology had evolved into leading our advanced engineering division, presented a breakthrough during this period that would prove critical sooner than any of us expected. "We've developed a shielding technology based on principles we first identified in that old scout vessel debris years ago," she explained during a briefing attended by our core leadership team. "It's not as advanced as current Concord military shielding, but it's significantly stronger than anything we've deployed before, and completely independent of their supply chains." "How soon can it be implemented fleet-wide?" Henry asked. 8 months, if we prioritize it correctly," Ellen said. "Prioritize it," I said, without hesitation. Grace, sitting across the table, studied the projected timeline carefully. "You really believe conflict is coming?" "I believe hoping it doesn't come isn't a strategy," I said. "We spent our first 5 years out here proving we could build something lasting. Now we need to make sure we can protect it." That conversation marked a quiet but significant shift in our priorities. Our expansion continued, our diplomatic outreach never paused, but beneath the surface, humanity and its growing coalition of partner species began preparing carefully, deliberately, for a challenge none of us wanted, but all of us understood was likely inevitable. I traveled extensively during this period, visiting each of our core colonies personally, meeting not just with human administrators, but with representatives from every species who had joined our coalition. I wanted every partner, every ally, to understand clearly that the strength we were building was meant for protection, not aggression, a shield built by people who understood exactly what it felt like to be dismissed and threatened by those who considered themselves superior. During one such visit to a Vray settlement that had grown significantly since our first contact years earlier, Thessa met me personally at the landing platform. her skin patterns shifting toward warm gold tones that I had learned represented genuine welcome. "Your coalition has grown remarkably in a short time," she said, as we walked together through streets filled with both human and Vray architecture blended seamlessly together. "The Concord took generations to build what you have built in 5 years." "We didn't have generations to waste," I said. "We had to move fast, or risk losing everything, before we even truly began." "That speed frightened the Concord once," she said thoughtfully. "I imagine it frightens them still, watching from wherever they continue to observe your progress." I thought about those old, silent relay stations we had discovered years earlier, at the edge of our home system, quietly watching, quietly recording. I had little doubt similar observation continued somewhere within our expanding territory, even if we could not always identify exactly where. "Let them watch," I said. "Let them see exactly what we've built without their permission. Maybe it will remind them why they were afraid of us in the first place." Tessa's patterns shifted into something I had come to recognize as quiet amusement, spoken like someone who has stopped seeking their approval entirely. "We stopped seeking it the moment those chamber doors closed behind us," I said. "Everything since then has simply been proof of what we're capable of building without it." As our visit continued that day, I received an urgent communication from Victor Lane back at Fleet Command, his voice carrying a tension I had rarely heard from him during our years working together. "Daniel, we need you back at New Providence immediately," he said. "Sensor arrays along our southern border have detected an unidentified fleet approaching. It's not one of our partner species, and it's not responding to any standard communication protocols." I felt the weight of everything Victor and Henry had warned me about settling into place at once. 5 years of careful growth, 5 years of partnership, expansion, and preparation had led toward this exact moment, whether we were fully ready for it or not. "How far out?" I asked. 3 days, maybe less, depending on their engine capabilities, Victor said. "Daniel, based on preliminary scans, this doesn't look like a scouting mission. It looks like the beginning of something much larger." I looked at Tessa, whose patterns had shifted toward a deep, serious shade I had never seen before, clearly having heard enough of the conversation to understand its weight. "The future you spoke of building without permission," she said quietly. "It appears someone has finally decided to test it." I nodded once, already turning toward the waiting transport that would carry me back toward New Providence, back toward whatever was approaching our borders, and toward the first true test of everything humanity and its allies had built together since the day the Concord decided we were unworthy of standing among them. The return journey to New Providence took just under 2 days, and every hour of it felt longer than the last. I spent most of it in the ship's small communications room, reviewing sensor data Victor's team continued updating in real time, watching an unidentified fleet grow steadily closer to the edge of our territory. By the time I arrived at Fleet Command, Henry Voss and Victor Lane were already waiting in the main strategy room, along with Ellen Price, whose newly developed shielding systems had been rushed into partial deployment across our defensive vessels over the previous weeks, far earlier than originally planned. "Talk to me," I said, stepping into the room. Henry gestured toward the central display, where a projected star map showed the approaching fleet as a cluster of red markers, moving steadily toward New Providence's outer defense perimeter. "We've identified them," he said. "The Skarn Dominion, a client species aligned closely with the Concord, though not formally part of Concord military structure. They operate with a degree of independence, which means the Concord can benefit from their actions, without directly claiming responsibility for them." "How many ships?" I asked. 42, based on current scans," Victor said. "Mixed classes, primarily mid-range warships, with what appears to be at least 2 larger command vessels coordinating the formation." Ellen added quietly, "Our southern colonies currently have 18 defensive vessels stationed within immediate response range. We're significantly outnumbered." I studied the map carefully, the weight of the moment settling fully into place. This was not a scouting mission or a misunderstanding waiting to be resolved through careful diplomacy. This was a calculated test, likely encouraged quietly by the Concord itself, designed to determine exactly how capable and how willing humanity had become to defend what it had built. "Do we know what they want?" I asked. "Initial communication intercepts suggest they're framing this as a resource dispute," Henry said, "claiming our southern colonies have expanded into territory they consider historically theirs, despite no prior Concord records supporting that claim. It's a pretext, Victor said flatly. They're testing our response. If we fold under pressure, it proves the Concord's original judgment correct, that we're not capable of managing independent territory responsibly. If we respond with excessive aggression, it proves the opposite concern, that we're exactly as dangerous and unpredictable as they claimed. I understood immediately what that meant. This was not simply a military challenge. It was a demonstration, watched carefully by an audience far larger than the fleet currently approaching our border. Then we respond exactly the way we should, I said. With strength, but with control, we defend what's ours. We do not become the monster they've been telling stories about. Over the following 18 hours, our defense network mobilized with a speed and coordination that surprised even those of us who had spent years building it. Ellen's newly deployed shielding systems, though not yet fully optimized, provided a critical advantage previous simulations had not fully accounted for. Marcus, working alongside emergency engineering teams, pushed through final calibrations on defensive weapon systems installed across our fleet during the preceding months. I took command aboard the Meridian's Oath, now refitted as our primary command vessel, joined by Victor as tactical advisor, and Nora Blake once again serving as lead navigator, her calm precision proving just as valuable in this moment as it had during our very first journey beyond Earth's solar system years earlier. As our fleet moved into defensive formation above New Providence, I opened a direct communication channel toward the approaching Skarn Dominion fleet, choosing words carefully, understanding that whatever I said in the next few minutes would echo far beyond this single confrontation. "This is Daniel Hart, representing the Sovereign Compact," I said, my voice steady despite the tension coiling tightly in my chest. "You are approaching territory that has been settled, developed, and defended by our coalition for over 5 years. We have no interest in conflict. We ask that you withdraw peacefully." The response, when it came, carried a tone of dismissive confidence that reminded me uncomfortably of that Concord chamber years earlier. "The exiled species dares to issue demands," the Skarn commander replied. "You occupy territory that does not belong to you, protected by technology copied poorly from those who understand its true value. Withdraw your defensive formation, or we will remove it by force." I felt Victor tense beside me, his hand hovering near the tactical display. "Copied poorly," I repeated quietly, almost to myself. Then, louder, directed toward the open channel. "Everything you see protecting this system was built by human hands, based on human understanding, without a single component borrowed from anyone who exiled us. You're welcome to test exactly how well it performs." The Skarn fleet did not hesitate. Their formation shifted immediately into an aggressive approach pattern, clearly intending to overwhelm our defensive perimeter through sheer numerical advantage. "Here they come," Victor said, his voice sharpening with focused readiness. "Hold formation," I ordered. "Defensive posture only. Protect the colony. Protect our people. But do not fire first." Henry's voice came through on a secondary channel from fleet coordination. "Daniel, are you certain about restraint here? They clearly intend to engage." "I'm certain," I said. "If this becomes a story told across Concord space, I want the truth to be undeniable. They attacked first. We defended what was ours. Nothing more, nothing less." The first exchange came moments later, as the lead Skarn vessels opened fire on our outer defensive line. Ellen's shielding technology, still imperfect but far stronger than initial simulations predicted, absorbed the impact with far greater resilience than the Skarn commander clearly anticipated. "Shields holding at 83%, Ellen reported from her monitoring station. "Their weapons are strong, but our coverage is more efficient than expected." "Return fire," I ordered. "Target their weapon systems and propulsion only. Minimize casualties wherever possible." What followed was not the massacre the Concord likely expected to witness from a distance, nor the chaotic, uncontrolled aggression they had long predicted from an unpredictable species finally pushed into conflict. It was disciplined, focused, and deliberately restrained, guided by every lesson we had learned during years of careful, hard-won preparation. Marcus, monitoring engineering systems throughout the engagement, worked tirelessly to maintain power efficiency across our fleet as the confrontation continued, ensuring shields remained stable even as damage began accumulating on both sides. 3 Skarn vessels disabled, Victor reported, roughly 40 minutes into the engagement. Propulsion and weapons offline. Minimal structural damage. Crews confirmed alive, based on emergency signal patterns. I watched the tactical display carefully as the confrontation continued, our fleet holding formation with a discipline that clearly began unsettling the Skarn commander, whose aggressive approach had not anticipated this level of coordinated, controlled resistance. Nearly 2 hours into the engagement, the Skarn commander opened communication once again, his earlier confidence noticeably shaken. "Your defensive capabilities exceed our previous intelligence estimates," he said. "This confrontation has proven costly, beyond acceptable parameters." "Then withdraw," I said simply. "We have no interest in destroying your fleet. We have only ever wanted to be left in peace, to build what we've built." There was a long pause before his response came through. "The Dominion will withdraw. This matter will be reported accordingly." As their remaining fleet began retreating from our system, Victor turned toward me, exhaling slowly, the tension of the previous hours finally beginning to ease from his shoulders. "We held," he said quietly. "We actually held." "We did more than hold," I said. "We proved exactly what needed proving." Before the Skarn fleet fully withdrew, I made one final decision, one I knew carried significant weight beyond this single engagement. I ordered the release of the disabled Skarn vessel's crews, unharmed, along with a recorded message intended to travel back through their command channels toward whoever within Concord space would eventually receive it. I stood alone in the communication room that evening, recording the message myself, choosing my words with the same careful precision I had used years earlier, while designing our very first colony charter. "To whoever eventually hears this," I said. Humanity was exiled for being too unpredictable, too dangerous to stand among civilized species. Today, we were tested, and we responded exactly as any civilized people would, with restraint, with discipline, and with a clear demonstration that we defend what is ours, without becoming what you feared we might become. I paused briefly before adding the final line, the one that would eventually spread across Concord space, far faster than any of us anticipated. "We remember everything, every judgment, every dismissal, every quiet laugh behind closed chamber doors. We remember it all, and we have chosen, deliberately, not to become defined by any of it." The message spread quickly following the Skarn fleet's withdrawal, carried through trade networks, diplomatic channels, and eventually, we would later learn, directly into the heart of Concord leadership itself. The confrontation that had been intended as a quiet test of humanity's limitations instead became undeniable proof of exactly how far we had grown since the day those chamber doors closed behind us. In the weeks that followed, our coalition partners across the Sovereign Compact responded with a surge of renewed confidence and commitment. Species who had previously remained cautiously neutral began formally requesting membership, having witnessed firsthand what genuine partnership with humanity looked like when tested under real pressure. Grace, reviewing incoming diplomatic requests during a briefing shortly after the engagement, could not hide the quiet astonishment in her voice. "We've received formal inquiries from 6 additional species over the past 10 days alone," she said. "Word is spreading faster than we ever anticipated." "Let it spread," I said. "Let every species watching decide for themselves what kind of neighbors we actually are, based on what we do, not on what the Concord once claimed about us." Henry, standing quietly near the back of the room throughout the briefing, finally spoke, his tone carrying a rare note of genuine optimism. "5 years ago, we were exiled and left with nothing but scattered technology and a single warning to stay confined. Today, we've built a coalition strong enough to successfully defend itself against a Concord-aligned military force, and species across this region are actively choosing to stand beside us because of it." I looked around the room at everyone who had helped build this moment: Marcus, Ellen, Victor, Grace, Henry, Nora, Laura, and countless others across our growing colonies who had worked tirelessly since the day we lost everything the Concord once offered us. "We're not finished," I said. "This was one test. It won't be the last. But for the first time since we left that chamber, I believe we're finally ready for whatever comes next." None of us fully understood yet just how quickly that next challenge would arrive, or how directly it would come from the very institution that had exiled us in the first place. forced now to confront the undeniable reality of exactly what humanity had built in the years since they turned their backs on us. 3 years passed following the confrontation with the Skarn Dominion, and in that time, the Sovereign Compact grew into something none of us could have fully imagined during those early, uncertain days after our exile. What had begun as a single colony orbiting a distant star had become a coalition spanning dozens of systems, home to 13 different species, each contributing their own knowledge, culture, and strength to something larger than any of them could have built alone. I stood on the observation platform of Meridian Station, our coalition's central hub, watching ships from a dozen different species move through coordinated traffic lanes below, a sight that would have seemed impossible standing in that Concorde chamber all those years earlier. The station itself had grown into a small city, suspended in orbit, a physical symbol of everything we had built without anyone's permission or approval. Laura Bennett approached from behind, her expression carrying a mixture of excitement and caution that immediately told me something significant had happened. "Daniel, we've received a formal request," she said. "A Concorde envoy vessel is requesting permission to dock at Meridian Station. They've asked specifically to speak with you." I felt the weight of that request settle over me immediately. "Did they say why?" "They didn't provide details," she said. "But Daniel, this is the first direct contact we've had with official Concorde leadership since the day we were exiled. This isn't the Skarn Dominion testing our defenses. This is the Concorde itself, choosing to come to us." I thought carefully before responding, weighing the significance of this moment against everything we had built over the previous 8 years. "Grant them docking permission," I said finally. "But make it clear, they're entering as guests within our territory, not as authorities we answer to." "Understood," Laura said, already moving to relay the message. The Concorde envoy vessel arrived 2 days later, a sleek, elegant ship, unlike anything within our own fleet, a quiet reminder of just how advanced their technology remained, despite everything we had accomplished independently. I met the envoy personally at the primary docking bay, flanked by Henry Voss, Grace Dawson, and Victor Lane, each of them representing different pillars of everything we had built together. The envoy who stepped off the vessel was not the same delegate who had presided over our exile years earlier, but the formal, measured tone in her voice carried an unmistakable familiarity nonetheless. "Daniel Hart," she said, studying me carefully, "you have grown considerably since the last time representatives of your species stood before the Concorde." "We've had 8 years of practice growing on our own terms," I said. "What brings the Concorde to territory they once told us to remain confined away from?" Her expression remained composed, though I caught the faintest flicker of something beneath the surface, uncertainty, perhaps even quiet respect. "The Concorde Council has reviewed recent developments across this region extensively," she said. "Your coalition's growth, its defensive capabilities, its diplomatic reach among species previously considered insignificant to broader galactic affairs. The Council believes it is time to reconsider humanity's status." I felt Victor shift slightly beside me, though he remained silent, allowing me to lead this conversation exactly as we had discussed beforehand. "Reconsider our status," I repeated carefully. "Meaning what exactly?" "The Council is prepared to offer humanity full reinstatement within the Concorde," she said. "Restored access to hyperlane networks, formal recognition as a core member species, and full diplomatic standing among established powers." The words landed heavily in the room, carrying implications that stretched far beyond a simple offer of reinstatement. I could see Grace and Henry exchanging a quiet glance, both of them clearly processing the significance of what was being offered, an outcome that once represented everything humanity had desperately wanted during those early, uncertain months following our exile. "Why now?" I asked, keeping my tone measured despite the weight of the moment. 8 years ago, we were dismissed as unpredictable, dangerous, unworthy of standing among civilized species. What exactly has changed within the Concorde's assessment since then? The envoy hesitated slightly before answering, an unusual break in her otherwise controlled composure. "Your continued success has prompted significant reassessment among council members," she said. "Your coalition now represents meaningful strategic and economic value within this region. Reinstatement would benefit both humanity and the broader Concorde structure." I understood immediately what she was truly saying, stripped of diplomatic phrasing. We were no longer being welcomed back, because the Concord had reconsidered their original judgment of our character. We were being welcomed back because our success had become too significant to continue ignoring. Under whose terms? I asked. Yours or ours? The envoy studied me carefully. Reinstatement would naturally require humanity to align with established Concord governance structures and protocols. Meaning we would surrender the independence we've spent 8 years building, I said. Meaning the coalition we've formed with a dozen other species the Concord once ignored entirely, would need to be restructured according to Concord standards. The Concord structure has proven stable and effective for thousands of years, she said. Your coalition, while impressive, remains relatively untested against longer-term challenges. I allowed myself a small, measured smile, though there was little humor behind it. Our coalition was tested 3 years ago, against a Concord-aligned military force, sent specifically to determine our limitations. We passed that test without losing a single life among our own people, and without becoming the aggressive, unpredictable threat you once claimed us to be. The envoy remained silent for a long moment, clearly aware of exactly which confrontation I was referencing. The council is prepared to overlook that incident, she said carefully, provided reinstatement proceeds, smoothly moving forward. Overlook it, I repeated. You sent a military force to test our defenses, and now you're offering to overlook it as a gesture of goodwill. Henry stepped forward slightly, his tone calm but firm. Daniel, perhaps this conversation would benefit from a broader perspective. I nodded, understanding immediately what he meant. This decision was far too significant to make alone, based purely on my own judgment or personal history with the Concord. It deserved input from every leader who had helped build what we now stood ready to potentially surrender or preserve. We'll need time to consider this offer properly, I told the envoy. This decision affects not just humanity, but every species within our coalition who joined us in good faith, believing in the independence and equality we offered them. We won't make that decision hastily, and we certainly won't make it without their voices included. The envoy seemed slightly surprised by that response, though she recovered her composure quickly. The council will await your response within a reasonable time frame. Over the following days, I called together representatives from every species within the Sovereign Compact, gathering aboard Meridian Station for what became one of the most significant meetings in our coalition's short history. Thessa attended on behalf of the Vray, alongside representatives from 11 other species who had chosen partnership with humanity over the years, each bringing their own perspective to a decision that would shape the future of everything we had built together. I stood before that gathered assembly, choosing my words carefully, aware that whatever direction we chose would echo far beyond this single meeting. The Concord has offered humanity full reinstatement, I said, watching the reaction ripple quietly across the room. Restored access to their hyperlane networks, formal recognition among established powers, everything we were denied 8 years ago when they exiled us. I paused, allowing the weight of that offer to settle fully before continuing. But that reinstatement comes with conditions, I continued. Alignment with Concord governance structures, restructuring of our coalition according to their standards, potentially, the surrender of the very independence and equality that brought each of you to join us in the first place. Thessa rose slowly, her skin pattern shifting toward a deep, contemplative shade as she addressed the assembly. The Concord ignored my people for generations, she said. We survived quietly on the fringes of their territory, never acknowledged, never valued. Humanity offered us something the Concord never did: genuine partnership, genuine respect. I would be reluctant to surrender that for the sake of an institution that only now finds value in us because of what we've built together. Murmurs of agreement rippled across the assembly, echoed by representatives from several other species present. Victor, standing near the front of the room, added his own perspective carefully. We've built something the Concord never managed to build themselves, a coalition based on mutual respect rather than controlled dependency. Reinstatement on their terms risks undoing everything that makes our coalition genuinely strong. I listened carefully to every voice within that room over the following hours, weighing the perspectives of species who had trusted humanity with their independence, their resources, and their future, against the undeniable pull of finally being welcomed back into the broader galactic community that had once dismissed us entirely. By the end of that gathering, the decision had become clear. not through my authority alone, but through genuine consensus among every species who had chosen to stand beside humanity throughout our years of independent growth. 3 days later, I met the Concord envoy once again at Meridian Station's primary docking bay, prepared to deliver our coalition's formal response. "The Sovereign Compact has reached a decision," I said, standing firmly before her. "We respectfully decline full reinstatement under the terms currently offered." The envoy's composure faltered slightly, clearly not the response she had anticipated. "You understand what you're refusing," she said. "Access to resources, technology, and diplomatic standing, the Concord has spent thousands of years developing." "We understand exactly what we're refusing," I said. "We're refusing to surrender the independence and equality we've spent 8 years building with species the Concord once considered unworthy of attention. We're refusing to become exactly what we always feared becoming, a coalition defined by someone else's rules rather than our own values." "Then what exactly do you propose instead?" she asked, her tone carrying a mixture of frustration and genuine curiosity. "Partnership," I said simply. "Not reinstatement under Concord authority, but formal recognition of the Sovereign Compact as an independent, equal power within this region. Trade agreements based on mutual benefit rather than controlled dependency. Diplomatic relations built on respect rather than conditional acceptance." The envoy studied me carefully for a long moment before responding. The Council did not anticipate this response. "The Council never truly understood what humanity was capable of building," I said. "Not 8 years ago, and perhaps not fully even now. But the offer standing before you represents exactly what we've become since the day you exiled us, a coalition strong enough to stand as equals, not desperate enough to accept anything less." She remained silent for several long moments, clearly processing the significance of what I had proposed, an outcome that would require the Concord itself to reconsider not just humanity's status, but the very structure through which they had always maintained their influence across known space. "I will carry this response back to the Council," she said finally, "though I suspect this conversation is far from finished." "We're not going anywhere," I said. "We've built something lasting, something worth protecting, and we're prepared to keep building it, with or without the Concord's approval." As her vessel departed Meridian Station shortly afterward, I stood once again on the observation platform, watching it disappear into the quiet expanse of space beyond our growing territory. Grace joined me there, her expression thoughtful as she watched the same departing vessel. "Do you think they'll accept those terms?" she asked. "I don't know," I admitted honestly, "but I know we made the right decision. We didn't build this coalition to eventually surrender it for the sake of approval we no longer need." Henry, joining us on the platform moments later, added his own quiet reflection. 8 years ago, we walked out of that chamber with nothing but a warning and a closed door behind us. Today, we sent the Concord's own envoy away, having refused an offer most species across this region would have accepted without hesitation. I thought back to that moment years earlier, standing in that grand chamber, hearing quiet laughter drift through translated static as we were dismissed as unworthy of standing among civilized species. I thought about every challenge we had overcome since then, every partnership we had built, every test we had faced and passed, not by becoming what the Concord feared, but by becoming exactly who we always had the potential to be. "They closed a door on us once," I said quietly, watching the stars stretch endlessly beyond Meridian Station. "We didn't just find another way through. We built an entirely new one, wide enough for everyone they had ever left behind to walk through beside us." Grace smiled faintly, watching the same endless expanse of stars alongside me. "What happens now?" "Now," I said, "we keep building, not because anyone gave us permission, but because we finally understand. We never needed it in the first place." Behind us, Meridian Station continued its quiet, steady rhythm, ships from a dozen different species moving through coordinated traffic lanes, a living testament to everything humanity had built since the day we were exiled from a chamber that once believed we would never amount to anything worth remembering. They were wrong, and somewhere, quietly drifting back through the stars toward Concord territory, carrying our answer with her, the envoy who had come seeking our surrender, now understood exactly how wrong they had been.